Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining today's session. My name is Joe Kuster. I'm the Director for Security and Compliance Solutions across Catapult Systems. Today, our topic is security tools you own, but probably aren't using. I think this is always one of those fascinating topics about how to improve your security state and really understanding some of the things that you have at your disposal that you may not be aware of. So I've got some fairly simple scenarios that we come across a lot in the field. Things that can lower your risk, harden your devices, otherwise be able to help protect against some of the more common threats that we see inside the field. As part of my team, we see a lot of hacker activity, a lot of attackers, a lot of employee misuse. And as part of that, we want to call out some of the ways that you can defend yourself. Now, I'm going to be talking about Windows 10 Edge App Guard. It's a really simple feature. I think that you'll actually get a lot of use out of once you explore what it can do. Windows Sandbox, so being able to have a containerized VM that you can blow up at any point in time with a few seconds, and that's it. Ransomware Protection, which is one of the leading costly and destructive security threats out there on today's security landscape, as well as how to better prepare yourself for a security incident through something as simple as OneDrive. There's a few settings that most people have not turned on that can drastically decrease the cost and expense around security incidents. So let's jump into it. It's familiar. An end user sends you a hyperlink in an email, and they say, "Hey, Joe, I can't get into this website." And maybe sometimes it's a URL shortener. Is it a phishing attack? Is it legitimate? Is the user just being the user? Likewise, what about whenever they send you a file attachment? Your malware tools didn't catch it. It didn't go off as a virus, but it could be an unknown threat. It could still be potentially risky or potentially malicious. So how do you balance ease of use for scenarios like that? Something, that's going to come up potentially multiple times a day. So safety versus ease of use. There's a couple really easy mechanisms that are already inside the tools you're already using. One of which is Windows 10 Edge App Guard. I know it's a bit of a mouthful, but what it really comes down to is saying an on-demand browser tab that's fully sandboxed. And so you don't have to download special security tools. You don't have to set up anything complicated. You don't have to harden your system to the point that it won't work. You also don't have to prep VMs that are persistent. You don't have to go through and say, I have an entire config manager lab that I have to keep up to date. And if I shut it off, then my domain joined VMs are going to lose AD trust. It's always part of that care and feeding of if you have a lab, you have to keep it patched and everything else. Sometimes you just need an on-demand way of doing something simple. And so whenever you turn on AppGuard, it has the ability of creating a clean, pristine tab environment. What it's doing behind the scenes is it's using the hypervisor capabilities to spin up a miniature version of the operating system and running Edge. So it's a fully containerized with hardware virtualization security wrapped around it. So if you have malware that would normally have taken over a browser, as an example, it can't go anywhere. It can't exit that sandbox. So what you effectively have is detonation control at your hands. Now, this is really easy to use. Now, there are a couple requirements. So as we go through and we look at, if you've got a 64-bit CPU, have you turn on virtualization extensions in your UEFI or BIOS? It does take some memory to run. And of course, you have to be on a compatible version of Windows. And I've listed those out. So if you're on 1709 or newer on Enterprise, you're good to go. 1803 on Pro, 1903 on EDU. But really across that, setting it up couldn't be easier. Whenever you turn on the feature, so if you've ever turned on a hypervisor, yeah, the BIOS has to be in compatible mode. That's actually done by default in many scenarios. But if you just enable the Windows optional feature, and if you run that PowerShell commandlet right there, it will install AppGuard, or you can navigate manually through the features. What that will do is once you've restarted, Edge will now have a new capability inside your browser tabs. So if you have any of those risky websites, you want to expand URLs to be able to see what's behind them, or simply testing in a scenario where, hey, you know what? In the past, I've used incognito or browse in private, because in some cases, you need to be able to have it where it's not inheriting your single sign-on tokens, your authentication, access to your other plugins. So this provides a secure sandbox that you can use for your own needs. So with that, let's see what that looks like. All I have to do is open Edge because I've already installed that particular feature. So here I've got a clean piece. And if I just browse up into the upper area, I can see new application guard window, or Control Shift A will kick it off as a key command. Now, can you make this default? Yes, you can make it part of the native browser experience, and you can toggle back and forth as a user proceeds through their session. That's it. This is a sandboxed VM, so you don't have to go through and have a special Firefox sandbox scenario. It's natively baked into the operating system. Now, whenever we look at what we can do with it, let's go ahead and take a quick URL shortener. In this case, it's f8s-link. .link. I have no idea. That's a URL shortener. So where does it go? So I may have had a malicious scenario, but in this case, I was just being rickrolled. But those are really simple scenarios, and you can actually, this is the type of thing where an end user can self-service with a little bit of guidance. But even from an IT standpoint, having a browser that you can test potentially unwanted software, do security testing and so forth, is incredibly helpful. Now, let's hop back into this because with that in mind, you probably are percolating on well, if that's sandboxed, how does that impact my end users? Can I take advantage of that across my organization? The answer is yes. So if you've ever managed trusted zones and so forth inside things like your group policies for your end users, you can do something very similar. So you can actually set this up in a way that your trusted websites that need full functionality, your intranet, your trusted business partners, et cetera, they will get the full experience. So your end users can take advantage of everything else inside Edge. But the moment they browse to an untrusted location, it can actually force that to open inside of a sandbox tab. So if they go off into somewhere else, they can't save those files unless you give them that permission. They can't print, and that web browser tab can't access other applications or capabilities. So if there is an exploit, it's not going anywhere. So it's a fantastically easy way of securing some of your capabilities. So things like whether or not you can copy and paste or save out of it, that's at your discretion. And you can make different modes or zones effectively to be able to help manage the end user experience. Now, as we go through today, if you do have questions, please just throw them in the chat window. Hopefully we'll have time to be able to grab them later. In addition, we do have a Q&A session set for noon Central Time. Okay, so let's move on to Windows Sandbox, because this is a similar super easy way of being able to give you a security trustworthy VM on demand. I don't have to build a lab. I don't have to maintain it. It's natively part of Windows. I don't have to patch it. It creates a pristine environment on demand. It's fully disposable. Nothing in the environment is retained. And it does use hardware virtualization security. Now, whenever we look at why you might want this, there's a couple things that come to mind. First off, if you're putting on your security hat, you may want to dig into what malware is actually happening on your systems. So as an example, if a user receives an attachment and it's kind of sketchy, but you don't really know if it's legitimate or not. Is it just a translation problem? Or is this something, sometimes a user will say, hey, something's infected my files, but I still need to be able to see what was in my spreadsheet. Okay, you're kind of doomed in that scenario because it may be potentially infected. This is a great way of being able to handle that. So in addition, just being able to have, hey, I've got scripts for patching my computers. I've got scripts for pushing out software. I want to test some weird hardening rules. Really, whenever it comes down to it, there's a lot of use cases for having a VM on demand that's fully prepped, fully provisioned, and I don't have to really set it up. Now, the thing is that whenever you're doing untrusted files and so forth, you do want to single task your sandbox because in some cases it may be installing something that is untrustworthy or malware, and it's actually infected at that point. So there's a couple things that you want to have as far as cautions. You don't want to be accessing trusted resource at the same time that you're testing untrusted applications or processes. So just click X, it'll kill the VM, start fresh as you need. Now, the other part is that I will suggest that if you're actually doing security testing with the Sandbox, um, connect to make sure that you're not behind the firewall first, because it will detonate inside that. If it takes over the VM, it is infected, but you close it and it's gone. But you don't want to be on the same network as something else that is particularly malicious. So as an example, you wouldn't want something spreading the zero logon attack as an example. But for just general testing and general purpose, disposable VMs on demand, testing websites that require plugins or are prompting you to download something, it's a really secure method. Now, enabling this is actually pretty simple, and it has very similar prerequisites to the last bit of saying, okay, you do need a 64-bit processor. You do need to have your virtualization capabilities turned on, and there is a minimum version. So 1830 or newer on your operating system version. Now, when we go through enabling it, if it's physical and you've never turned on hypervisors and you've never used VMware or you've never turned on Hyper-V, you do have to turn that feature on inside your BIOS or UEFI. Now, across that, if it's a VM, that's a different scenario. So you have to enable what's called nested virtualization. And again, that's really simple. So if you're on the host computer running hypervisor, here we've got a quick PowerShell that can enable the VM processor to be for the virtual machine to be able to run nested hypervisor capabilities. Just run the PowerShell if it's in Hyper-V and you have that particular scenario where you're in a VM that you're also trying to run a Windows sandbox inside of. Now, the feature itself is just item 2, that enable Windows optional feature. That's it. So once that's done, restart your computer. Now, can you do this through group policy, through systems management, through configuration manager? Of course, it's actually rather simple. And if you're going to turn some of these things on, you can make it part of your operating system deployment plan. Simple task sequence will take care of that. Now, let's take a look at this. So all I have to do is hit my start menu. And since I've already enabled this, I have Windows Sandbox added into my start menu. And again, it's just a native Windows 10 feature. So with this, it'll start spinning up a VM on demand, and within a few seconds, we have a clean build. I didn't provision this VM beforehand, and even if I tried to, it would be scratched out. So at this point, we've got a completely clean virtual machine that I can test. Now, there's a couple things to understand. It's not connected to your domain. It didn't do anything else. It is a clean build of Windows 10. It set up some prerequisites, so it's just username user as an example, but that's intentional, and that's a good thing from a security standpoint because we don't want you to conduct security testing where it's a trusted user. Now, in this particular scenario, if I hop over to my Word document, let me go ahead and grab a quick example. Now, if I'm going to test something that includes downloads and so forth as part of it, so I have block at first sight, and I can create a brand new virus threat, basically, and be able to do some testing. Now, in this case, I can create and download a brand new file. Now, it's going to ask me for a set of credentials. Now, this is something to be very cautious about because you don't want to log into trusted scenarios whenever you're logged into one of these while you're also testing malicious tools. This case, I do know that it's actually okay. Now I'm going to put in my email address. Now, one of the things that it will do is if you've never used it before, there's a feature called passwordless authentication, and it's amazing. But you'll notice I wasn't prompted for a username here. I'm actually going to see a send notification. Now, at this point, some of you may be familiar with this feature, but effectively, I've got a pop-up with which number do I see on the screen, and I hit approve. Now, as part of that, it does a biometric check. So let me put that in. What I did there is I logged in with 2 factors, including basically something I have, my phone, as well as a biometric check. Password wasn't part of it, but now I have my file. So now I can hit save and let's go ahead and run it. Now, in this case, it's telling me, hey, this is an unknown threat. Well, of course it is, because it has a brand new definition. Now, if you're going to attend my session later today, when we get to malware, this is really important. What this website did is it made a custom definition for an attack on the fly. That is no longer sophisticated, high-end capabilities. That's just general advanced malware. So as we get into protecting against that in my session later today, you may want to factor in how easy that was for that to be created. So in this case, I'm going to hit run. Since it was a brand new, never seen before attack, it kicked off. And in that scenario, I could have hardened Defender against it. I could have done a lot of things to prevent it, but in this case, I haven't. So as part of the testing, this gives me a very easy way of saying, yeah, this particular exploit did kick off, and it did have malware code in it. Now, let's go ahead and hit enter, and effectively, it's infected the system behind the scenes. But this gives me a safe test bed, effectively. Now, if I had tested with other scenarios, it would have been far more destructive. So this helps me guide my security hardening across my environment. And really, across this, I've now infected this device, but you know what? I can just close this box and it's gone. That entire system's gone. And the second I try and open it again, I'll get a fresh VM. So as we go through this, let's switch to probably one of the most concerning types of threats out there today. Whenever we look at ransomware, there's a lot of concern around it because just like that website showed, you can generate a new definition on demand now. All it does, it has the source code of the particular attack, jams in some additional binaries at the bottom, compiles it, and issues it out for spreading. That's all it takes. So in that scenario, ransomware has gotten really, really good at avoiding traditional types of attacks. Now, whenever we look at the ransomware protection that's built into Windows 10, a lot of people haven't explored this. It's part of Windows again. And what it does is it prevents untrusted applications from accessing your common files, my documents, my desktop, etc. It has easy to manage exemptions. So I can say, hey, if it's coming from Configuration Manager or my normal trusted systems management tools, okay, I'm going to trust it. But if it's not something like that, then I'm going to make sure that it can't interact with my files. So it gives a very simplified methodology of this. If you've ever done AppGuard in the past where you're doing a full approved application list and blocked application list, if you can run in your organization with that, more power to you, fantastic. The challenge is that most organizations don't have that maturity. They don't know all their line of business applications. So this gives them a more flexible methodology because otherwise you end up breaking a lot of subsystems. Now, as you go through it, it does provide history of what has been blocked, what hasn't. It does tell you specifically, okay, these are your protected folders. You can customize it to add in additional locations. And it does give you recommendations about how to tune your systems to be able to say, okay, well, I see particular vulnerabilities that are important as you explore through that. And here's some that are recommended that maybe not as critical, but still something you should consider. So with that, let's go ahead and kick off some ransomware. So I've got my computer here, and I've got a particular unsigned test file that has been generated using that same type of methodology where the website expanded it out, put in some unique code so it's not a known seen before in the wild threat. Now, additionally, I have let me go ahead and move it over. My files here are, C drive demo, and I've got a particular attack that's going to launch against them. Now, if I look at my ransomware protection, and again, this is just inside the start menu. So if I run that, I'm going to see my current protections. So currently, right now, it's on. And I'll be able to see that, okay, I have my protected folders. Let me go ahead and open this. I'll see that C drive demo is currently protected. So with that, let's go ahead and run it. If I run this, it popped up, tried to, and immediately failed. And whenever I go back to this, I should be able to see, okay, well, it has blocked it. And in addition, I see that it has detected that a untrusted application tried to access this particular folder and was blocked. Now, what happens if I turn this off, which is what most of you are running at right now? So at this point, if I run the same file, I have now ransomwared my computer. So you get to see how simple that was. Uh, to be able to go through and say a native Windows 10 feature was actually quite successful at stopping that if I had turned that on. Now let's go over to our files. We can actually see where it's modified and encrypted these files. That's it. So really throughout that, can it be centralized on management of this particular attack? Absolutely, and you should. And through those type of scenarios, it's pretty easy to be able to get ahead of some of the challenges you are likely to run into with ransomware. Now, let's go ahead into another thing. What if the tools didn't work? What if somehow you managed to get a system infected? Now, that's a big deal because, as an example, if ransomware kicks off, you may have not just one computer, you may have a lot of computers infected. And one of the challenges is, what about the cost? What about the data recovery? What about the time lost in outages? That's a really big deal. So there's a couple things that you can do that are very simple that are probably part of something you already own that you just aren't taking advantage of. So if you use OneDrive for Business, and frankly, it'll even work on your home OneDrive Personal, one of the features is called known folder move. So inside the Windows file system, there's a topic or a feature that is known as soft redirects and hard redirects. What it means is that a file can be in one place but show up in another. It's not a shortcut. It's basically being able to say that file is technically in both directories at the same time. And what that does is by turning on known folder move, it creates basically those links inside the OneDrive subfolder. And what it does is it's invisible and transparent to the end user experience, but you get to define, hey, I would like an endpoint backup, because endpoint backup strategies have always lacked a lot of capabilities where, okay, well, if I have an on-prem backup solution, they have to be on the VPN or on my company network for the backup to even work. Now, well, the other thing that this gets is if the end user is using mobile devices, work from home approved scenarios, and company issued assets, this gives them a synchronized way of having folders flow automatically from device to device so that the files they need are there, so they're not doing things like throwing it in personal Dropbox or throwing it in Google Docs. So that works in your favor here. Now it has full file versioning control, so you can roll it back each iteration. Likewise, you can turn it on to be able to do more than just file backup because you can tie it into some of the other features, and we'll talk about that with Windows 10. But basically, you can get it to the point where it's backing up their My Documents, it's backing up their bookmarks, it's backing up the themes of Windows, their settings, their language profiles, things like that. And suddenly, whenever you have that type of information permanently backed up and kept up to sync, when you do have something like ransomware that attacks the files, if it succeeds, you'll wipe it and you have not lost a single bit of data, which is really powerful because you can roll it back to a trustworthy state and rebuild from it. You can tie it into tools like Windows Autopilot, which is how this device was prepared. Basically, what it amounts to is at the Windows 10 reset functionality, I can sign in with my email address. As an end user, that's all I have to do. Type in my email address, and it automatically downloads, as an example, Microsoft Intune, applies my applications, applies my security settings, joins it back to my domain, brings in my data and my settings. So I can't really tell I've lost anything if I do it right. So what that does is it streamlines recovery and drastically reduces the time and cost around a post-incident scenario for security. So as we look through that, that's an important fact to take advantage of. It's really easy to turn on because it's a single registry key. Now, can you push it out through GPOs? Yes, and you probably should, or you can do it through Config Manager or through Intune. You can make it where your users have full capability of being able to say, okay, if you're using OneDrive, I'll just push this little setting out for you, and it happens seamlessly to the end user. Now, there's a couple cautions and a couple pieces of here to factor in. It does do the seamless redirect, and there's a lot of synergy between some of the other cloud security, DLP, malware scanning, etc. Because what we've found universally is a lot of people don't have solid control over what data is on their endpoints. They really don't know, and sometimes they're afraid to peel back the bandage. Likewise, whenever you look at how OneDrive for Business works, you do have the opportunity of configuring files on demand. So you can significantly reduce the hard drive footprint. So if the device is lost, there's less data on it. But likewise, you may be in one of those scenarios where employees, if they keep everything forever, you're always having to buy them a bigger hard drive. And those nice new shiny solid states, they get kind of expensive whenever you're buying more than a terabyte. And it may factor into what type of laptops you're able to purchase. But the interesting part is this creates an on-demand synchronization where if you want to take advantage of that feature, you can say the files that they need and that they're working with are always on the device. But the stuff that they haven't touched in a long time, maybe it's left in the cloud. If they click on it, it has to download it back down to the device. Again, that's one of the things that you want to factor in. You don't have to use that feature, and it's not going to change anything by default, but you do want to make sure that if you are going to use that you are educating your end users on how it works. Likewise, you can integrate this with the Windows 10 Sync Your Settings. That's where you start getting a light version of roaming profiles, or what they call an enterprise roaming state. And so one caution that you may want to consider if you're going to push this feature out, and I do recommend that you do, you want to factor in what your network throttling is, because if you have a bunch of users in the same building, you probably don't want them all at the state of back up my computer as fast as possible. That's firmly inside your control, and it's a couple set check boxes basically, and you can choose whether or not you have it integrated in. Now, the thing to be aware of is once it's in OneDrive, they could share it and access it from other systems unless you have those correct controls, and we do recommend that you put those in place. Likewise, you may find people have had files around for 20 years. And if that's the case, things like employee ID numbers used to be social security numbers back in the day. So you tend to find a lot of a resurgence of, hey, they had malware infected files, or they had sensitive information we had no idea about. If you're turning on tools like Cloud Application Security, Office 365, or Office ATP, et cetera, and you're turning on that scanning, you will see that data surface. It's easy to manage, but at the same point in time, you may suddenly have a much heightened awareness about what all is on your endpoints. All right. So the Windows 10 sync settings that have a lot of synergy here. So if you've ever gone into the sync your settings feature, it can do a lot. And there's actually a couple different versions behind the scenes. I'm going to try and simplify it as best I can. Enterprise state roaming keeps common device settings backed up and synchronized across devices, and as well as part of the backup strategy for it. So if you have to nuke a computer, you can get it back with all the settings intact. That way users are less likely to have pitchforks and torches at your doorstep during a security incident. Now, you do have to enable this. So inside the Azure portal, I've kind of got the rough instructions out here. You can just click all or select it and say who gets that capability. Now, one of the sub features you may want to be careful about is whether or not you allow things like Edge and IE password saving. I'm not really a fan of that because it's not really as amazing of a password vault, but there are ways of securing that better. So you want to be careful about what features you are and aren't allowing to make sure it abides by your company's data handling policy. So again, that's really easy to manage. Pull in the ADMX, push it out through GPO, push it out through Intune, push it out through Configuration Manager, etc. Now, on the back end, prerequisites is just go into the Azure portal and turn it on. Okay. Now, if you have surfaced all of that data, you may be panicking because suddenly it found a whole bunch of PCI data or HR data, etc. The risk hasn't necessarily increased, but you do want to make sure that you have guardrails around that type of thing. Simple DLP policies, simple item leveling protection policies that encrypt it go a long way to helping with those issues. Okay. Now, as a bonus, another tool that ties into those previous ones that you may want to factor in, especially in this time of COVID and all the other pieces. One of the tools that many people have at their disposal is things like multi-factor authentication. So here you're talking more in the E3 territory for EMS and so forth, but a lot of people have it. And if you do have it, there is one thing that a lot of people aren't taking advantage of, because if they haven't rolled out MFA to their entire organization, which they should, but if they haven't, there's a short-term gap strategy that has quite a bit of meaningful scenarios to it. So if I'm looking at how NIST and Microsoft consider a multi-factor experience, it's not just a prompt on my device. It's not just that experience that you saw earlier. Instead, what you can do is, as long as you have two or more out of the three columns of something I know, typically a password or a PIN number, something that I am, said biometric check. I put in my fingerprint here, or I've got retina scanners on my monitor that as soon as I walk up to it, it logs me in. Likewise, it can be something I have. Now, that's something I have. Frequently, people think of it as my phone number. Well, that's actually not that amazing, but maybe it's an enrolled application. Okay, that's okay. But it can also be it's a domain joined laptop. Well, we have a lot of those out there in the world. So you can actually tie that into your backup strategy or your conditional access strategy on protecting your identities, to be able to say that the device must be compliant and enrolled with Intune, or it has to be known and tied to an Active Directory. Now, if it's a BYOD scenario, you may choose to use Azure AD join, where somebody's able to join their home computer and be raised up to an appropriate security bar. I'm not trying to overly complicate it, but if you have a lot of your company issued domain joined laptops currently floating out there, which a lot of people do, now that people are using them from home, you can actually, inside Azure AD Connect, configure it so that all your on-prem domain joined computers are raised up and now basically presented, and Azure AD has a list of them. So you can check, is this one of my devices, before I give you access to a service. So just because you've allowed everybody outside the firewall doesn't mean that you can't put in enforcements and say only a domain joined laptop can get to this service because I have sensitive data in it. Just food for thought as you go through these things. All right. So I'm going to pause here for questions as we go through this. If you do have questions, please put them in the chat window, and I'll try and knock them out as time permits. Now, I guess I can go ahead and ask folks, are these tools things that you are already familiar with, or is this news to you about using things like the sandbox mode, bringing in things like hey, if I have Edge in place, I can automatically create a sandbox tab on demand? All right. So, with the time that we've got left, it's always helpful for us to know how we did. And, please do take the time. You can aim your smartphone and grab a QR code, or you can grab the hyperlink inside the chat window, to be able to enroll for a raffle for receiving a gift card. So if you do have those, if you want to be able to grab a nice snazzy $250 gift card, certainly enroll and let us know how we did with our particular session. And so I do see Ed's got a question in the chat window. Is it difficult to preserve personal privacy when employees are connected from home? Really across that, there are a handful of methods to be able to go after and address problems like that. I think that's actually going to be in some of the sessions that we have later today. But we do have, there's a lot of strategies around being able to do that, and being able to make sure that your network is trustworthy, that your endpoints are trustworthy, falls a long way into it. I don't encourage things like anonymized VPNs, and I don't encourage things like Tor, because many of them are not run by trustworthy sorts. So it can actually backfire horrendously when we get into actually securing personal privacy. Because in some cases, personal privacy and corporate security are at odds. If you hide where you're really from and you hide whatever devices you're on, then we don't know that you're actually in the area of operations that we expect to see you in. So it is a challenge, and there are strategies around being able to handle that. Things like being able to say, okay, I'll allow you to connect off of these VPNs, but only if you're on a trustworthy device. Otherwise, I can't tell you from an attacker. So I want to be able to put in controls around those type of pieces. I hope that makes sense. And as we go through the last part, if you have any questions about have I secured my Office 365 tenant appropriately? Am I being hacked? Have attackers already got malware behind the scenes? Do I have breached accounts? We do have assessments that are very tactical to be able to go through and provide the analysis of quick discovery with M365 tools, being able to provide that security briefing that includes understanding of what your users are doing, what business processes are putting you at risk today. So it's not just what settings, it's actually how you're using the systems that we can get into and identify the risks around them. And lastly, you do leave those assessments with a full security roadmap. So we try and build in, here's your risks, vulnerabilities, and exposure, and tie those into, here's the things that will address your urgent security problems. Here's the things that need to be addressed that you can do low-hanging fruit that are going to be invisible to the end users, as well as here's a continuous security improvement program strategy of being able to execute. So you walk away with a complete understanding of your current risks as well as how to move forward. I hope that's been helpful today. And lastly, I want to say thank you for jumping on this session. We definitely appreciate your time. And if you do have questions, I do have a Q&A follow-up at noon Central Time.